So what we're looking at is a sequence of frames from the film Dog Star Man by Stan Brakhage. And I don't know whether my videotaping this image is a violation of copyright restrictions or not. But if you scroll down, you'll see that it says sequence of frames from Dog Star Man Part 4 by Stan Brakhage, 1964, the same year in which I was born, courtesy of the estate of Stan Brakhage and Fred Camper. And why Fred Camper partially owns the copyright or rights to distribute images of this film, I don't actually know. But I do know that this image appears on the right-hand side of a page in a magazine called Caesura. And Caesura is interesting because it can represent a lot of different things, but it's a cut or a measurement of a kind of cut. It comes from the word Caesar, but relates to the fact that Julius Caesar was born Caesarean, and the word Caesarean derives from the fact that it's named after Julius Caesar, right? A cut, and it's come to mean, though, the space of a pause or the separation, and I like the idea of it being a reference to the spaces between these various images or frames, and perhaps pause can relate to the idea of the perceptive attention that certain kinds of cinema call to the apparatus itself. In other words, if this were to proceed smoothly and invisibly, one would see the continuation of the motion as, you know, a perfect illusion of the way that we see motion in the world. I'll scroll down and I'll give a different account. You see the segmentation of motion here, and sometimes in avant-garde film, which is what Camper describes this particular film as embodying in terms of the, not, I wouldn't say genre, but discipline, or one could say it's broader than genre, isn't it? Film movement, or a kind of, one could say, phenomenological and epistemological approach to the act and art of making cinema. But whatever one calls it, and it isn't always part of the aesthetic, but the flicker and or whatever else might result from the apparatus in the spaces between can become part of the aesthetic. And they have that notion of the caesura, or pause between the frames, or whatever it is, that materiality that calls attention to the way that motion and movement is produced as an illusion, is certainly something that I've worked with, you know, even in the video that I've made, and certainly something that, you know, Brakhage utilized in his work, from, you know, calling attention to flicker in various ways, and utilizing the relationship between the frame and the movement within the frame, or the illusion of movement within the frame, you know, and you know, probably the profoundest example would have been, you know, Mothlight. As a kind of aside, it's interesting that this image already is framed and edited, isn't it? Because we see the sprocket holes here on the left side of the image, but not the right. And presumably, you know, the film requires sprocket holes on both sides of the track, right? We say track that relates the film to the metaphor of the train track, and the metaphor of the film's motion to the metaphor of the motion of a train, as in, you know, some of the very earliest films, the arrival of the train, for example, in the Lumiere film. So so one of the things that interested me is that you can play this film. It's not really long enough to give you much, but you can play it. But you only seem to be able to play it in one direction, and that's curious to me, and I wonder why. But perhaps, you know, we could say that you can play it in two different ways. It'd be like imagining that you have a flute, and you can play this flute by blowing air either through the flute or sucking air through the flute. And if you blow air through the flute, perhaps you get, you know, a continuous kind of harmonious and fluid series of notes, and perhaps you get an erratic and choppy series if you inhale. And I'll demonstrate that first. So first I'll demonstrate the kind of motion that you get, the kind of caesura that you get if you scroll down. And then I'll demonstrate the kind of continuous motion that you get if you scroll up. So here's one of the frames, and that's scrolling down. All right, now let's go back. And here's another frame, and here is scrolling up. All right, again, there's not much room to demonstrate the motion, but what you can see is that you get, especially if I slow down a bit, a much more continuous motion. And I don't entirely understand why that is. See, here's scrolling down. I'll go back. I'm going to back up a little bit. Here's scrolling up, and this is scrolling down. Right? So the caesura, or the attention that that is called to the apparatus or the way that I'm producing motion is much greater if I scroll down than if I scroll up. And I don't know why that is. This is scrolling up. This is scrolling down. And I don't know why that is. And no matter what I do, and no matter how fluid I attempt to scroll down with the mouse, you still get the same effect. That's scrolling up, scrolling down, scrolling up. You still get the same effect. And so that's a physics problem that I'm kind of interested in. But the image itself interested me, you know, for a number of reasons. Because the physical element of the film, which is part of the overall apparatus, right, is aestheticized in and of itself here as a static work of art. And you know, I've used that strategy before as well. I used it in a piece called The Dream Portraits, that I composed using a machine that takes multiple images, and this machine is located at the Museum of the Moving Image, and you can stand in front of this machine and perform any act of motion that you like, and then it records that act of motion, and then you can purchase these paper representations of images that recorded that motion, and you can cut them out and assemble them into a flipbook, and then it is another way of creating this illusion of motion. And what I did with these images was, rather than assembling them into a flipbook, I assembled them into pieces of pages in a series of representations of these dreams that I would perform in front of this machine, this camera machine. And then each of the frames sometimes, or series of frames, would have labels, and I could control that way the relationship between minute changes in the motion and frames and what I wanted to say. So say in this image I wanted to say, describe holding an axe, or if one wanted to, one could imagine that, let's perhaps imagine that instead, we know that it's an axe that he's swinging here, but let's instead imagine that it's a sledgehammer. And I could talk in minute detail about the very small movements of motion and describe narratives in these micro terms. And I would, address these dreams that I had, or I would address these constructed dreams. They weren't all dreams that I had. Some of them I made up and were fictitious dreams, but they were all relevant to, a set of work that I was doing at that time. And here, the caption that you get is very different. It doesn't tell a story, right? This is very much like the label that you would read of a work of art, a painting. So say that you went to the Louvre in Paris, or you're in Madrid, and you're looking at a Velázquez, and it tells you, when it was painted and the title, and gives you various kinds of information. And here the caption for this piece, becomes and also like points to, it gives a kind of, what's the word that we're looking for? It underscores the right of authority, right, that the writer has over this image. Not only is the writer Fred Camper the key brackage scholar, but he in fact has some kind of, for one reason or another, has some kind of ownership and possession over the image itself, and that's one of the reasons why I wonder if what I'm doing here is a copyright violation. And if this movie that I'm making is my movie entirely, or if it's some way restricted now, what if I added a soundtrack? All right, so here's a line, the first line from section 2 of Fred Kamper's essay on the death of avant-garde film, which I've responded to elsewhere in various ways. But the first line of the second section reads, "The initial masterpieces of American avant-garde film were made in a position of distance, even complete alienation, from the mainstream mass-market tradition of Hollywood filmmaking and from the mass culture of which commercial filmmaking is a major part." Now that's a lot to say, and maybe too much to say, but I could say the initial masterpieces of American avant-garde film were made in a position of distance very easily. And so if I make a film and I use that as the soundtrack, I'm wondering if I've committed a copyright violation. And let's try it. And another way to do it might be to jump through the text and just randomly or apparently randomly. See, there are other clips as well from different. This one is one that Fred Kamper doesn't seem to have any ownership rights over, so I really want to stick with this one. So if I stick with this one and read the text that's on the left side of the page, I pretty much have to stay within section 2, which begins with a quote that's ascribed to Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Cézanne was oriented toward the idea or the project of an infinite logos. So if I quote that, that's already Kamper quoting Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and there's no question that I won't be violating any copyright restrictions. So I prefer to quote his, even though in some ways his writing isn't as eloquent as Merleau-Ponty's or as interesting, but let's go ahead and see what we can do. And I'll scroll, let's see, I'm gonna get a sense of where I end. I don't want to go beyond there. All right, so that's, however, unconsciously. I'm just marking my spaces and then back up to the top. Get a sense of where we're going. Here's okay. All right. Time and narrative and the visual technique. Sorts decades continue to exist in a wheel eccentricities of dress, great number of avant-garde films where rapid camera as cogs of continuous space continue to exist in a wheel, long line had Hollywood viewer different from mainstream avant-garde separation eccentricities these and many filmmakers filmmaking this space other techniques each film avant-garde and perception striking different from mainstream that which first flowering from each avant-garde from the mainstream filmmaking this films other techniques each film avant-garde filmmaking striking aesthetics this is a result which first flowering from filmmaking differently from the mainstream effects individuating techniques is on this Christopher McLean's great European many characteristics stream of images absorbing extreme aesthetics this individuation difference perception time filmmaking differently from filmmaking individual as a unique individual speaks to him initial decades many images great work many characteristics images stream images absorbing which individuation this characteristic of perception time seeing as we shall seeing as we see viewer as a unique individual speaks to him initial decades many images warrants comments these images result towards this movement which filmmaking characteristic of avant-garde narrative and seeing as we shall seeing as we see a social network filmmaking striking against eccentricities of individual speaks to him a major part seems film stream of images and avant-garde represented had Hollywood viewers of each rebellion these this result towards this movement filmmaking in which techniques other exhilarating anti-social act different from mainstream individuality to be affected perception acts filmmaking this film other techniques each striking avant-garde filmmaking that which first flowering from that which first flowering from the mainstream avant-garde from the mainstream it films in filming European avant-garde this is a result avant-garde aesthetics this is a result aesthetic this is a filmmaking different filmmaking different individuating techniques individuating techniques many characteristics Christopher great work many characteristics great work images absorbing extreme images individuation film this individuation are different from filmmaking him different initial decades many images to him initial decades many images initial decades many images streams characteristic from images situation seeing as we shall seeing as we shall seeing as we shall individual see striking major part filmmaking individual speaks to him a major individual speaks to him a major part rebellion of images and these this result towards this rebellion these this rebellion towards this these this result towards this anti-social which techniques exhilarating anti-social anti-social individuality affected individuality affected perception of decades avant-garde films where rapid camera as cogs of continuous space continue to exist in a wheel long line had Hollywood viewer different from mainstream to see separation eccentricities these and many filmmakers filmmaking this space other techniques each film avant-garde and perception striking different from mainstream that which first flowering from each avant-garde from the mainstream filmmaking this films other techniques each film avant-garde filmmaking striking aesthetics this is a result which first flowering from filmmaking differently from the mainstream effects individuating techniques is on this Christopher McLean's great European many characteristics stream of images absorbing extreme aesthetics this individuation difference perception time filmmaking differently from filmmaking individual as a unique individual speaks to him initial decades many images great work many characteristics images stream images absorbing which individuation this individuation characteristic of perception time seeing as we shall seeing as we see viewer as a unique individual speaks to him initial decades many images warrants comments these images result towards this movement which individuation characteristic of avant-garde narrative and seeing as we shall seeing as we see a social network filmmaking striking against eccentricities of individual speaks to him a major part seems film stream of images and avant-garde represented had Hollywood viewers of each rebellion these this result towards this
this movement filmmaking in which techniques other exhilarating antisocial act
different from mainstream
individuality to be affected, perception acts,
filmmaking
this,
film
other
avant-garde
techniques,
filmmaking
each
striking
avant-garde
results,
filmmaking,
that
striking
which first
results,
flowering from
that
each
which
avant-garde
first
from the
flowering
mainstream,
from each
avant-garde
films
from the mainstream,
it films in filming European
filming
this is a result of
avant-garde
this is a result this is filmmaking from filmmaking different individuating techniques based on individuating techniques many genres images great work many characteristics images absorbing extreme images individuation from individuation are different filmmaking different initial decades many images unique initial decades initial decades many images streams characteristic from images streams seeing as we shall seeing as we shall seeing as we shall individuals speaks to film individual speaks to him a major individual speaks to him towards his rebellion of images and these this result towards this rebellion exhorts these this rebellion towards this these result towards this anti-social which techniques other exhilarating other anti-social individuality to be affected individuality to act filmmaking perception acts filmmaking individual as a unique individual speaks to him initial decades many images great work many characteristics images stream images absorbing which individuation this individuation characteristic of perception time and seeing as we shall seeing as we see viewer as a unique individual speaks to him initial decades many images orange kinds the images result towards this movement film individuation characteristic of
time and narrative and the
seeing as we shall seeing as we see a social network filmmaking striking against
eccentricities of
individual speaks to him a major part seems film extreme of images and avant-garde represented
had Hollywood
point viewers of each
number
rebellion
of avant-garde film
these this result towards this movement filmmaking in which techniques other exhilarating antisocial act
different from mainstream
individuality to be affected perception acts filmmaking this
film
other techniques each
striking
avant-garde
results,
filmmaking
that
striking
which first
results,
flowering from
that
each
which
avant-garde
first
from the
flowering
mainstream
from each
avant-garde
films
from the mainstream
it films in filming European filming this is a result of this filmmaking this is a result this is filmmaking from the mainstream it films in filming European filming this is a result of this filmmaking this is a result this is filmmaking from
filmmaking time and narrative and the visual continue to exist in a wheel number of avant-garde cogs of continuous space continue to Hollywood viewer different from numbers of avant-garde
many filmmakers filmmaking each film avant-garde filmmaking
that which first flowering from each
the films other techniques
striking
aesthetics this is a result
which
from
first flowering
effects individuating techniques many characteristics stream of images streams perception time filmmaking different from individual speaks to him initial decade many characteristics images stream images absorbing characteristics perception time seeing as we shall see individual speaks to him initial decades many images result towards this movement film individuation
narrative and the
seeing as we shall see filmmaking striking against
eccentricities of
individuals extreme of images and avant-garde speech
rebellion
these this result towards this movement filmmaking in which techniques other exhilarating antisocial act
different from mainstream
individuality to be affected perception acts filmmaking this other techniques each
striking
avant-garde
results,
filmmaking
that which first flowering from
that
each
which
avant-garde
first
from the
flowering
mainstream
from
avant-garde
films
from the mainstream
it films in filming European filming this is a result of
avant-garde.
Aesthetics, this is a result. Aesthetic, this is a filmmaking from filmmaking different individuating techniques, individual great techniques, many genres, Prfrmnc great work, many characteristics, individuation absorbing extreme images, individuation from film, this individuation has different from speaks to him, different initial decades, many images to him, initial decades, many images, initial decades, many images, streams characteristic from images, situation, seeing as we shall, seeing as we shall, seeing as we shall, individual speaks to him, filmmaking, individual speaks to him, a major individual speaks to him, a major part, rebellion of images, and these result towards this rebellion, filmmaking, these this rebellion towards this these result towards this anti-social which other exhilarating anti-social individuality affected individuality affected perception of avant-garde film or rapid camera as cogs of continuous space continue to exist in a wheel long line and Hollywood viewer different from mainstream avant-garde separation eccentricities these and many filmmakers filmmaking this space other techniques each film avant-garde and filmmaking striking different from mainstream that which first flowering from each avant-garde from the mainstream making this films other techniques each film avant-garde filmmaking striking aesthetics this is a result that which first flowering from filmmaking differently from the mainstream effects individuated from filming's great European many characteristics extreme of images absorbing extreme aesthetics this individuation different perception time filmmaking differently from filmmaking individual as a unique individual speaks to him initial decades many images great work many characteristics images stream images absorbing which individuation this individuation characteristic of perception time seeing as we shall seeing as we see viewer as a unique individual speaks to him initial decades many images oranges kinds these images result towards this movement which individuation characteristic of avant-garde narrative and seeing as we shall seeing as we see a social network filmmaking striking against eccentricities of individual speaks to him a major part seems film stream of images and avant-garde represented had Hollywood viewers of each rebellion these this result towards this movement filmmaking in which techniques other exhilarating anti-social act different from mainstream individuality to be affected perception acts filmmaking this film other techniques each striking avant-garde filmmaking that which first flowering from that which first flowering from the mainstream avant-garde from the mainstream is it films in filming this European avant-garde this is a result avant-garde aesthetics this is a result aesthetic this is a filmmaking different filmmaking different individuating individual great techniques many genres Prfrmnc great work many characteristics extreme images absorbing extreme images individuation film this individuation has different from filmmaking him different initial decades many images to him initial decades many images initial decades many images streams characteristic from images situation seeing as we shall seeing as we shall seeing as we shall individual speaks to striking filmmaking individual speaks to him a major individual speaks to him a major part rebellion of images and these this result towards this rebellion these this rebellion towards this these result towards this anti-social which techniques other exhilarating anti-social other act exhilarating anti-social individuality to affected individuality to act filmmaking perception from filmmaking individual as a unique individual speaks to him initial decades many images great work many characteristics images stream images absorbing which individuation this individuation characteristic of perception time seeing as we shall seeing as we see viewer as a unique individual speaks to him initial decades many many images, warrants, kinds. These images result towards this movement, filmmaking, characteristic of time,
narrative, and the
seeing as we shall, seeing as we see, a social network, filmmaking striking against
eccentricities of
individuals speaks to him a major part, seems film, stream of images and avant-garde represented,
had Hollywood
point
viewers
exhorts of each
number
rebellion.
of avant-garde film
This result towards this movement, filmmaking, in which techniques, other exhilarating, antisocial act,
different
cogs,
from mainstream
individuality to be
separation
affected,
views,
perception, acts,
filmmakers,
filmmaking,
this
film,
other
techniques,
each striking
avant-garde
results,
filmmaking,
that which
first
results,
flowering from
that
each
which
avant-garde
first
from the
flowering
mainstream,
from each avant-garde
it
from the
films
mainstream
in it films in filming
this
European
avant-garde
filming
this is a result of avant-garde
filmmaking different filmmaking different individual
techniques
many genres movement many extreme images individuation film this individuation different filmmaking him different initial initial decades initial decades many images